Good afternoon, or good morning as the case may be, if you're in Western Australia. I'm Simon Jackman, Professor of Political Science and Chief Executive Officer of the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney. Welcome back to 2021 series of webinars. This year, this is our monthly chat that my counterpart Gordon Flake at the Perth USAsia Centre and I do through 2020. We were doing these monthly. We've decided to continue them into 2021 as there's so much to talk about and analyse for Australian audiences coming out of the United States. This year, by mutual agreement, Gordon and I will be spending a little less time. Obviously, the election's behind us, and policy is going to be, at least if we can, be a bigger focus for us in our monthly conversations this year. But without a guest today, we thought kicking off there'd be enough for us to talk about. And of course, you know, the deck chairs are being hastily rearranged in Washington as we speak. So it'll be just Gordon and I today. But thank you to the 400 people that signed up in advance for today's event. Those numbers, by the way, are indicative of the intense levels of interest in what's happening in Washington as we transition to a new administration and trying to understand what the new administration and its policies and indeed the politics that are happening in Washington right now, what they all might mean for Australia. As is customary, let me acknowledge the fact that the United States Study Centre stands on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people, part of the Eora Nation there in Sydney. I'm actually in Brisbane today, combining a bit of work with a bit of family catch-up now that the borders are open. So these are not my usual work surrounds today. And Gordon Flake joins us from the University of Western Australia. Hello, Gordon.
Simon, looking forward to this conversation, joining you from the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation here in Western Australia. So let me extend our respect to their elders past, present, and emerging as well.
Thank you, Gordon. Great to have this series up and running again. But let's get right in it. We've got 1 hour and there's a lot to get through. So Gordon, first question to you. Look, I mean, we have to start here, and we said we would ahead of the call today, but January 6, 2021, it's one of those dates that has been immediately seared, I think, into our consciousness about American politics and American history. I wonder, Gordon, if you know your reflections on the day, perhaps some of the events and how it unfolded, and the reaction of the president, but then people around him, and of course it sets us up for the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump that I think hangs over this new Congress and frankly sort of American politics at the moment. Until I think that is out of the way, we have to address it as the Congress feels they have to address the events of January 6. But Gordon, your reflections on the day, and in particular, perhaps pivoting to what it implies, you know, politics and the policy climate in the Congress, perhaps in particular right now.
Well, thank you, Simon. I appreciate your use of the word seared because it really is seared on my memory. I'm not of the age that I remember when JFK was shot, but obviously for me, you know, the shooting of Ronald Reagan, the loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger. There are a few key events where you remember exactly where you were, and this will always be one of those. I had gone to bed the night of the 6th of January here in Australia after having had a long conversation with several of my fellow kind of political junkies here in Western Australia. We have a governor, Kim Beazley, and a former foreign minister and defense minister, Stephen Smith, who had spent the evening talking about the election results in the special election in Georgia. It's easy to remember that something historic also happened on that day. The state of Georgia had elected for the first time ever in a special election its first African-American senator. And we went to bed that evening quite optimistic because the polls showed that it was very likely that they had also returned a full Democratic ticket in the first ever Jewish American senator. So I woke up the morning of the 7th here, which would have been mid-afternoon, late evening, or early evening of the 6th in Washington, D.C., and quickly jumped on Twitter because I wanted to find out what I thought would be good news about the special elections in Georgia. And then immediately encountered these searing images of an insurrection, of an attack on the U.S. Capitol. And for our Australian viewers, it's hard to explain. You know, I never worked on Capitol Hill, but I spent 25 years in Washington, D.C. And when Americans talk about the Capitol as being a temple of democracy, there is an element of hallowed ground, of sacredness about that. And it hit me. It was just shocking to me to see violence in the Capitol, death in the Capitol, the desecration of that cradle of democracy. And so it is a pretty rough way for the next 48 hours as this played out. I was deeply encouraged by the decision of congressional leaders to immediately, once the Capitol had been secured and resecured and cleaned out, to come back and carry out their constitutional duties. And it's important to remember that despite all the chaos, in the end, the systems of democracy worked. In each and every state, many of them with Republican governors and legislatures, the votes were certified. They were duly counted by the Congress on the 6th of January. And a few weeks later, just 2 weeks later, we saw a polar opposite image of the U.S. Capitol, the pomp and circumstance of the inauguration itself, with beautiful poetry and all the pageantry and dignity that the United States could muster, a sharp juxtaposition. But obviously, things that are that serious can't just be ignored. And that is at the crux of what's happening in Washington, D.C. this week, and it's at the crux is what's going to happen next week as we start the second impeachment trial of now former President Donald J. Trump. So again, the things that I'd welcome your reaction to as well. Obviously, we had a vote on the House today to strip a highly controversial Congresswoman, Marjorie Taylor Greene, of her committee assignments, given her support not just for the insurrection, but a whole range of QAnon conspiracy theories purporting violence, etc. You also had yesterday a secret vote by the Republicans to remove Liz Cheney, the third-ranking Republican in the House, from her position, which failed in the secret ballot. And you've had ongoing Republican efforts to censure members of that party who have supported Donald Trump in this process. And so it's a very active and ongoing battle for the soul of the Republican Party, and thus something that impacts the United States. But that's the context in which the impeachment you raised is taking place next week. So a lot there. I welcome some of your reactions as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Gordon. Look, real quickly, I think you encapsulated it well. My reaction as well, just aghast. But on the other hand, and Gordon, I want to ask you this. I wish I could say I was totally surprised, and I was shocked but not surprised. It's a hard, maybe there's a word in German for that.
Probably a very long one.
yeah. But how could it have ended differently, given what the president and people around him were saying? There was no compromise. There was never any, in the face of court case after court case, just this sticking to their guns about the election being stolen. I won in a landslide. Everybody knows it. You know it. How was that going to end? The phone call, leaning so hard on these Republican, in some cases, local level election officials in Michigan and Georgia, state level in Georgia, we know about those. And then the rally itself, just what was, and what did they think Pence could do or would do? And I just had this, as I was watching it, part of me was, it was the exact form of it, obviously, you can't foresee that, or I didn't, but I'm just wondering, Gordon, your thoughts on that, sort of the arc that perhaps got us there, particularly through the post-election period, but perhaps going earlier as well, the way I think, we'll get into the GOP's issues in a moment, but the way I think we'd been set up for this for a long time, frankly.
Well,
The presidents, as I think I said in print somewhere, at best a cavalier attitude to the use of violence, or encouraging or references to violence, sort of a casual cavalier attitude to violence in the service of political aims and ambitions.
now you framed it very well, and that actually frames the ongoing challenge for the Biden administration and for the United States. And to get a sense for scale, I referenced very briefly the fact that the third ranking Republican in the House of Representatives voted in the House to impeach the president, right? One of only a handful of Republicans that did so. And that has led to this is the daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney. That has led to particular ire among the Trump wing of the party against her. So Matt Gaetz, a congressman from Florida, who's a well-known and particularly vocal Trumpist, flew the day before yesterday to her home state of Wyoming to lead a rally on the steps of the Wyoming Capitol against a fellow Republican congresswoman, one of his leaders. And they all predicted that she would be removed from her leadership post. Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader, the minority leader in the House, made the decision to have a secret ballot. And remarkably, in that secret ballot, it was basically 2/3 to 1/3, against removing her from her position. In other words, only 35% of Republicans voted to remove Liz Cheney. Now, another way to look at that is a stark number, 35% voting to remove one of their leaders just for calling out a president who called for violence and who basically stoked an insurrection which led to the sacking of the U.S. Capitol and deaths. 5 people died, right? So, it's a pretty stark divide. But that gives you a note that without the public eye, without the fear through which Donald Trump has wielded power for much of the last 4 years, the fear of being primary, the fear of losing to this group, it's about 1/3 of the Republicans, 35% who are hardcore Trumpists. Now, that's a problem for the Republican Party, right? Because they're already today a party that in the last 4 years has lost the presidency, they've lost the Senate, and they've lost the House. And to hope to take it back again without that third gives you the fundamental challenge they've got. At the same time, the actions of that third, as we've seen today through the words of Marjorie Taylor Greene, fundamentally jeopardize their chances for the future, because a large portion of America is rejecting that type of highly divisive, highly violent language. But again, going back to your question, the challenge we face is that you've got not 1/3 of the country, but 1/3 of the Republican Party, which are true believers, right? Who are hardcore Trumpists, who believe in the conspiracy theories of QAnon, and to the point that the Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. intelligence services this week came out with a very specific warning about the risks of right-wing terrorists. And so again, big shift in American politics. The U.S. Super Bowl is coming up. The focus is not on Islamic terrorists, but it is on religious extremist terrorism. Right. It just happens to be those particular followers on the far right side of American politics.
Gordon, I'm just wondering if you could, let's just see if we can quickly put you on the spot here and pivot to how does this affect Australia? We'll get the foreign policy per se in a moment, but look, we've been talking about this now for 15 to 20 minutes. Just connect the dots for us. I hope that's a softball question. Why should Australians care? I mean, it's horrifying. It's a spectacle. We watch it. You know, you and I are both US citizens. Or dual nationals. You know, we react perhaps a little differently. But why should Australians? How do those events start to cut across or have implications for Australian national interests?
Well, look, on a broader picture, we're dealing with some fundamental questions about information, how you access information, trust in institutions, trust in the news, and the same channels of information which have led to that hardcore 35% of the Republican Party being conspiracy theorists, QAnon, hardcore Trumpists, also has an impact here in Australia. We read the same Facebook stories. They're spread through the exact same mechanisms. And there is an ideological affinity that I think it has already impacted our politics today. And had we had 4 more years, I think it would have been worse. And so in the short run, I think Australia has really dodged a bullet. Now, to step back and put that on a policy perspective, you know, look, I actually think Australia managed the Trump era better than any other US ally. If you look at the early days when obviously the government at that time, Prime Minister Turnbull, Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, etc., they had to fundamentally recalibrate Australia's position towards the U.S. due to an unexpected victory by Trump. And again, Australia was helped by the fact that we don't have a trade deficit with the United States. We have a trade deficit, not a trade surplus, and we spend more than 2% of our defense budget, our budget on defense. So we have always been kind of the gold star ally. But there was an awful lot of work done on the part of Australia to kind of calibrate that relationship. There has been a real spike in worry in the Australian media that somehow now that we've got a conservative government in Australia and now a very progressive government in the US, that we're going to be out of sync. It's going to have a negative impact on us. And I couldn't disagree more. Obviously, there are going to be issues that are going to require kind of close coordination, and there's going to be some tensions. Climate change springs to mind immediately. The Biden administration has placed a high priority on climate change, and that will permeate almost every element, from security policy to foreign policy to energy policy. So that's there, that's not a question. But the US-Australia relationship has always been much stronger than an individual person, a la Donald Trump, or an individual issue like climate change. And the important thing is Biden's first 2 weeks has made pretty clear the full spectrum of areas where Australia and the US can and will cooperate. There is a whole range of areas where the Trump administration was hostile to Australia's national interests. We are, at our core, supporters of the rules-based order. At our core, we're supporters of the liberal international system, institutions, standards, norms, and multilateralism. And all of those were kind of foreclosed because the Trump administration was hostile to them. Now, again, on the full range of issues, whether it's health, the World Health Organization, or trade, or human rights, you can go through the full spectrum. They're once again on the table. And so I'm pretty optimistic. And we saw this from very early phone calls from the US Secretary of Defense and State to our Minister of Defense and Minister of Foreign Affairs here. Just yesterday, the phone call between President Biden and Prime Minister Morrison, really emphasizing the full spectrum of areas we're going to work together. So I'm someone who is very optimistic about the impact of the transition in Washington on Australia and on Australia-US relations.
Yeah, well, we'll get into a few details on the foreign policy stuff a little bit later. Time is rushing by. Gordon, the other thing I feel is though you can't have a conversation about the United States. You cannot be in a conversation, or has to be, pardon me, sorry, has to be in a conversation about the United States is COVID, and the way I think we've got a pretty marked contrast now, certainly in rhetoric so far, and I think with every passing week in policy substance, to the contrast between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. In his inauguration speech, Biden referred to this as a winter of peril, but also then he said, and opportunity. The daily fatality counts out of the US, I mean, a good day is when it's below 2,000, but there have been days the day of the Capitol Hill riot, or at least the day afterwards, and that whole week leading up to, and the couple of weeks leading up to Biden's inauguration and the first week of his presidency, over 4,000 people a day passing away from COVID or COVID-related illnesses in the United States. I'm wondering, Gordon, you're thinking about the importance of COVID, both substantively as a real thing for the United States to be confronting, the sort of the steps the Biden administration is taking, and perhaps some of the political consequences as well. Just thinking about, I've got my own assessment about that, but maybe I'll let you fire away on some reflections on that.
As of today, the rolling 7-day average of fatalities in the U.S. is still over 3,000 a day, which is just stunning to look at it from an Australian perspective, where we haven't had fatality since December. We're a little bit humbled here in Western Australia. We've been pretty smug for the last 10 months without a case, but I think that we had our first case over the weekend in 10 months, and we had a quick lockdown for a weekend. Fingers and toes crossed that will be lifted later on today. But having said that, it does provide me with a unique perspective to look back at my homeland. I have mid-80-year-old parents who mercifully were just vaccinated today. The rollout of the vaccines has been quite remarkable. As of today, there are about 28.5 million vaccinations that have taken place. That accounts for about 22% of the prioritized population, about 8.2% of the overall population. So a long ways to go. There is some optimism now that, combination of the change of the weather, the combination of people wearing masks with the new mask mandate, the fact that actually we have transparency, that Anthony Fauci can talk every day and use science without having to think about, what the political implications of his commentary is, are all very kind of helpful on that front. So I think there is indication that the rate of daily infections will continue to drop, and then it will accelerate in its decline once the impact of vaccinations comes in. There have just been several really encouraging studies this week that show that the vaccination itself does help impede the spread, not just whether or not you contract the illness. So again, stark difference between us here in Australia, but relative to the trajectory the United States was on, a positive one. I do actually have a question for you on domestic politics, but your take on COVID first.
Yeah.
All right. Well, go ahead.
I'll look, my own, I think Biden now owns the issue. He has said it's time now for a national policy research. That was in his inauguration speech too. Finally, there will be a national response to this issue. He's put Fauci front and center. He's put hard numbers up there, 100 million vaccinations in the first 100 days. The single biggest piece of legislation I think that this Congress will deal with over its 2 years, and we're only at the start of its 2-year term, is this COVID relief package. The proposal for 1.9 trillion, how quickly, and the final form of that legislation and its success in sort of delivering relief to American households and firms and state and local governments, and sort of the medium to longer term impact of that. I think you put that plus the vaccination program together, they will define whether the Biden presidency is a success or a failure. I think everything's going to pivot of these first 6, perhaps to 9 months, in arresting, dragging the COVID pandemic to ground and getting the economy firing. If this huge stimulus goes through, and it kind of has to, because I think, again, from Biden's perspective, politically, but I also think in terms of, jolting, completing the recovery, it's a sort of a stalled recovery, economic recovery in the United States from COVID, as right now in the middle of a winter where the public health crisis is probably at its most dire. I just think the stakes couldn't be higher for Biden politically, and perhaps for the United States materially, substantively. I think what follows from that, the politics around it, the way votes are being set up, Democrats control the majorities in both Senate and House in terms of the agenda setting power. And if Republicans want to vote against this stuff, yeah, sure, bring those amendments and go on the record, and let's find out. Particularly, perhaps, to being quite political opportunistic about it, Gordon, exploiting some of those differences you were alluding to earlier, drawing attention to, I think, a pretty vivid and stark cleavage among Republicans right now. And that's all to do more about congressional politics, looking ahead to the 22 midterms. But certainly, I think US domestic politics, once we get this impeachment trial behind us, is going to be all about COVID, the response to it, political ownership of success or failure with respect to these incredibly ambitious, but necessarily so, targets that the Biden administration has put out there.
No, you're spot on. Well, hey, look, I realize we got a lot of questions, and you've got other questions yourself, but I want to take advantage of the opportunity to do a little bit more analytical thinking rather than just reporting on the events of the day, because with your 20 years at Stanford, your tenure now at the United States Study Center, there's few people in the U.S., let alone in Australia, that have your intensity of focus on the voting process in the United States.
Yes.
And it seems to me that there's a bit of a tension between two things that have happened. So in my home state of Arizona, clearly in the state of Georgia, there was this tremendous voter organization, Get Out the Vote organization,
Yep.
Stacey Abrams and other Georgia, that really turned the tide. It made the difference, right? And that was competing with well-documented, and again, you've testified before, the Supreme Court of various states on efforts to gerrymander districts, yep. To restrict voting. So I've seen recent reporting that in the response to what's happened in Georgia, that Republican legislators across the country are scrambling now to intensify their efforts at voter suppression. They're trying to kind of react. And I'm curious as to your take as to how that is playing out now and how that will play out between now and the midterms 2 years from now, because that seems to be the ground game where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, no, it's a great issue to put on the table, Gordon. And indeed, I'd point out that the first bill on the House of Representatives agenda, HR 1, House of Representatives Bill number 1 of this current Congress, is a sweeping piece of legislation proposing lots of money, federal money, for universally across states and local government, increasing access to the polls, simplifying and unifying, imposing some uniformity on vote by mail procedures. The carrot, if you will, to try and get Republicans on board is money for state governments, some of whom are Republican, but ballot security as well, is sort of the political frame to try and get that through. But the bigger issue, and the way you framed it, Gordon, is correct. It's an uncomfortable fact, but there's one side of American politics that is interested in seeing fewer people vote, and that's in a way that I think it's very confronting for Australians and conservative friends in Australia to have to understand that about their American conservative cousins, as it were, that one side of American politics is frankly fearful of what happens as voter turnout goes up, because recent history shows that particularly in swing jurisdictions, as more people vote, there are more unmobilized Democrats out there than there are unmobilized Republicans, and that in general, I think the last couple of cycles have shown that as turnout goes up, Democratic candidates tend to do better. And we're back to an old story in American politics. Look at the battleground states on this. And it's the states of the former Confederacy, but now throw in a few surprising, states. It's Minnesota's and Wisconsin's and Michigan's as well, Ohio, Missouri as well, with some border states in the Civil War. But it is a battle that is overlaid on long-standing cleavages around race and inequality that have legacies going right back to the Civil War. And I think a stark reminder for Australians that the fight, and it is a fight, for a truly inclusive citizenship is not finished in the United States. It is a struggle that goes on. And the only other observation I'd make, Gordon, is that don't underestimate the power of Trump as a mobilizing factor for Dems. You mentioned earlier that under Donald Trump, Republicans lost the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. Trump himself was just perhaps the best turn out the vote, get out the vote agent that Democrats could hope for, as much as he mobilized people on his own side. And the first insight we got into that was the 2018 midterm elections, which produced century high turnout in the midterm elections. Record numbers of Republicans turned out, but they were overwhelmed by the response from Democrats. And a similar thing happened in the presidential election in 2020, that when turnout goes through the stratosphere, Democrats kind of win that turnout drag race, and indeed won it. And again, now we have to get down to a local level and focus on I think Stacey Abrams, just a political phenom. What's happened in the state of Georgia is just remarkable. I think it brought forward something people thought might have been in the offing 10 to 20 years from now, to bring it forward to 2020, that it has narrowly voted Democratic in a presidential election, and its 2 Senate seats are flipped. It's just a remarkable political development. And I think it just points back to this very stark question confronting Republicans. And so do you double down on the strategies that were kind of working through suppressing the vote? Or is it time to sort of wake up and look ahead to a changed America, one where the electorate that has been our core for a long time needs to grow because it's becoming increasingly infeasible to win through.
So if they say,
turnout.
We long have the axiom that demography is destiny. And after the 2008 loss under John McCain, the Republican Party got together and said, hey, look, we can't win a national election unless we have a platform and positions and politics that is more appealing to women and minorities. And then after the 2012 loss under Mitt Romney, they had the exact same kind of portion. And instead, they went the exact opposite direction with Donald Trump. And to his credit, I guess you can use the word credit, he actually, for the first time in 50 years, bumped up the percentage of the overall electorate that was Anglo, was white. And he can rightly claim that in 2020, he actually got even more votes. I mean, 74 million Americans came out to vote for that. But it really is a tension in the contest, because you rightly pointed out that 81 came out and voted for Joe Biden. So the level of voter participation was something remarkable.
Yeah.
One thing we haven't mentioned yet, which is just stunning to me, is Twitter. The last month has been serenely quiet because of that. The president being banned for Twitter. And I have to wonder how the current debate in the House and the Senate, to have Mitch McConnell, the now minority leader of the Senate, come out and call Marjorie Taylor Greene a cancer on the Republican Party and loony, whether these things would be still taking place if the president was dominating the airspace. The only thing we've heard from the president in the last 48 hours is He has withdrawn his membership from the Screen Actors Guild, and he did so on a letter which, against the law, used the seal of the United States, in which he signed President Donald J. Trump. And so there are some issues that will be coming up in the impeachment next week, which are tied to the unique personality and character of the former president.
Yeah. Hey, Gordon, I'm wondering at 35 minutes in, quickly, let's touch on, let's do a quick pivot to foreign policy. One thing that I think a lot of us who pay close attention to the appointments will be aware of is that this is a team of national security advisors and foreign policy advisors around Biden that have a lot of ties to Australia. Australia's sort of on the radar for these people. I'm wondering, again, you have some close ties to some of these people at an individual level, Gordon. Could you just perhaps mention a few names and their histories and why I think the Australian foreign policy and defence establishment is actually feeling pretty comfortable, pretty reassured by their opposite, who are their opposite numbers in this Biden administration?
Shortly after the inauguration of President Trump 4 years ago, I wrote a short article called, Follow the People. My apologies to the Follow the Money crowd, because in the end, the administrations are staffed by people. They're the ones who have policies and ideas and vision. And rightly, a heavy focus has been placed on the Biden cabinet. As of today, 6 members of his cabinet have been confirmed by the Senate. There are another 13 that have been nominated that haven't been considered, another 31 that are in the process of Senate hearings right now. So a little bit slower than normal, but it's a strange time in terms of getting the cabinet up and running. As you mentioned, every one of them are people who are kind of known and respected on a bipartisan basis, and almost every one of them have deep and long-standing relationships to Australia. So you're absolutely correct. There's a sense of familiarity, a sense of relief, if you will. It's important to note that the Trump administration had a very difficult challenge, in that the majority, the overwhelming majority of the Republican foreign policy establishment in Washington, D.C., these are the people who normally fill these political appointee positions, had signed on to never Trump letters, and so they weren't available. And so Trump never in the course of 4 years filled, I don't think he ever got more than 70% of his senior Senate confirmed political appointee positions filled. They mostly stayed. And Joe Biden on his first day conducted a Zoom video call where he virtually swore in 1,000 political appointees. These are mostly junior ones who didn't require Senate confirmation, so they could just swear them in. And then also those who are in the office of the White House itself that don't require Senate confirmation. So Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, very early on, even before the inauguration, said some very strongly supportive words about Australia as we were suffering under direct Chinese pressure. Then, to the immense relief, not just of Australia, but the region writ large, Kurt Campbell, former Assistant Secretary of State, was appointed as an Indo-Pacific czar. It's a great terminology. Maybe the one element of Russia that's left over from the last administration, I'm not sure, but we'll keep the term czar. But again, Secretary Austin in Defense is actually less known. Tony Blinken at the Department of State, extremely well known. Janet Yellen at the Treasury Department, extremely well known. Avril Haines at the CIA, extremely well known, or the Director of National Intelligence, rather. So I think there is a tremendous sense of relief. I would also point our viewers today, President Biden went to the State Department to deliver his first foreign policy speech. And the location is really important. President Trump viewed career diplomats as the enemy, as the deep state. And candidly, there was opposition among career diplomats to an approach which was very undiplomatic, you might imagine, right? Having said that, I think the Biden speech location was a signal that he trusts, the expertise of the career diplomatic community. And the overall theme of the speech was America is back. Now, obviously, given the difficulties of the last year, particularly in alliance relationships, there's a lot of hard work to be done. But I've yet to see an assessment of the speech that didn't find it exactly the words the allies like Australia or Japan or NATO were looking to hear. A very full-throated defense of America's role in the world for America's own interests as well as the interests of the world. So that's something that I would urge our viewers to look at carefully. Good speech
Yeah,
today.
yeah, well said. And key thing, we'll get into this in future calls, but as the shape of a comprehensive, frankly, we'll call it a China policy, but an Indo-Pacific strategy starts to emerge from the Biden administration. Its integration with elements of domestic policy in the US, Build Back Better, for instance, infrastructure investments in government-led investments in strategic industries, implications for Australia and opportunities for Australia and risks to Australia in some cases through all of that. That's obviously material Gordon and I will be exploring with interlocutors from Washington and the United States in the months to come. But something where both of our centres are like intensely tracking, perhaps the single biggest point of differentiation when it comes to prosecution of a China policy, if you will, between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, one in which allies figure way more prominently. And I think giving voice to the aspiration that I think people around Trump were trying to get going, and that is a truly integrated approach to dealing with this huge challenge, integrating elements of what you're doing domestically with the foreign policy end states you're looking to bring about in concert with allies. Gordon, let's turn to some questions because we've got a ton. So many people signed up. It's our first webinar for the year. A ton of great questions. Josh Bahari from Pfizer Australia asks, could a future Republican-led Congress overturn a decision by this current Congress to ban, if that current Congress were to ban Trump from ever running for federal office again?
So the short answer is we do not know. One, it's not clear that the president will be impeached. In fact, it seems unlikely. There was a test vote on the constitutionality of impeaching a former president. And again, there's some controversy here, right? As you will recall, immediately after the events of the 6th of January, when there was pressure to impeach the president and hold the trial before the inauguration to remove him, then Mitch McConnell, then still the Senate Majority Leader, said, no, there's not enough time. We can't do this while he's still president. Let's do it afterwards. And then predictably, after the election, Mitch McConnell voted with those that says, well, we can't invoke him after the election because he's already gone. And the primary purpose of impeachment is constitutionally to remove someone from office. They're going ahead with the trial. I think the real fear on the part of the Republican Party is that if there's a trial where there are witnesses called and it's open and transparent, the sheer evidence that's going to come out is going to make it increasingly difficult for them because there is a lot of unanswered questions about the 6th of January. You know, why was the Capitol Police Force unprepared? Why did they not get the National Guard called in? Why was there only, you know, with a crowd of tens of thousands of insurrectionists, as we can call them, that marching on the Capitol, why were there only 1,200 police officers there? What was the communication from them in the White House? And as that comes out with the power of a subpoena, it's going to be an interesting period of time. But even then, obviously the president is gone. Impeachment would have the effect, potentially, if successful, of preventing the president to run for office again. I don't think an executive order by a future Republican president could do that. It's untested in legal waters completely as to whether or not a future Republican Senate would want to do that either. But a lot depends on how things play out. Yeah, you know, and a lot depends on, you know, the future of the Republican Party. Which direction do they take? Do they take the decision that some have taken to try to purge the Trumpist element of them and rebuild on core conservative principles, or do they remain the party of Donald J. Trump? And as you see, that debate is taking place this week, and it's not conclusive in any way.
Yeah. Hey, we've got a question here. Oh, that essentially also, look, I'm going to bundle here because there's so many questions and time is tight. But Laura Jays from Sky asked, how does the Republican Party move on from Trump? Was Trump an aberration or the new normal? Um, I think that's exactly what we're finding out, Laura, over today's votes. And Gordon drew attention to the fact that a secret ballot broke 2/3 for keeping Liz Cheney in her position, whereas an open vote on the floor of the House of Representatives to strip Marjorie Taylor Greene of her committee seats only got 11 Republicans in favor and 10 Republicans voted for impeachment. I think expect plenty more votes like that. I think where Democrats will delight, frankly, in beating up their Republican counterparts with votes that expose this sore inside the Republican Party. With impeachment, I think being perhaps sort of the most dramatic instantiation of that. And you know, the Senate during the trial, the Senate will vote repeatedly on whether to call this witness or that. Even those votes, the procedural votes through the course of the impeachment, they're all going to be so fraught.
So there's an underlying issue here, which is really important, and I think we've forgotten about it for the last 4 years, and that is the cleansing power of daylight, of transparency. For the last 4 years, and again, I'm being blunt here, the Trump administration abused the power of the presidency to cover up its own transgressions. And so we didn't see a lot of those. But again, there's that old adage that the wheels of justice grind exceedingly slow, but they grind exceedingly fine. This issue is not over. You know, those issues are outstanding, they're ongoing. And now that the Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and there's various investigative organs of government, I think you're going to see a lot more information out there, which is going to make it more difficult for those issues to kind of be swept under the rug going forward. And so for those who say impeachment is irrelevant, we already know that the Republicans are going to let him off, that you're not going to get 2/3. Now, that's not the issue. The issue is transparency. The issue is information. And I think we're going to see that in the coming days and weeks.
Gordon, let's a few.
My apologies about the doorbell, by the way.
That's all right. We're 11 minutes away, so let's get through some of the foreign policy questions. We've got really super questions here. Trevor Rowe from Rothschild Australia asks, does Australia have an opportunity to deal with our China problem via any, quote, grand deal the Biden administration might ink with China, say with climate change and trade being fused?
Short answer is no, there is no grand deal. I anticipate that the Biden approach to China will be more nuanced, as you might anticipate. It will be done in much closer coordination with allies like Australia, and as such will be more effective. But the world has shifted, and most importantly, China has shifted. And so often our debate here in Australia tends to think in a self-flagellating way that somehow we're the problem, that we did things wrong, and if only we'd have said something slightly differently or at a different time, then things would be fine. When the reality is, if you look at Canada and the UK and Germany and Japan and India, they've all got the same fundamental challenges with the more aggressive approach under President Xi Jinping in China. And there is a complete and total awareness of that, of the incoming and Biden team. So again, there's not going to be a grand bargain. There's not space for a grand bargain. What there is space for is cooperation. Now, on the positive side, my colleague Jeff Wilson, who's our director of research and has been nonstop on China, probably not by desire, but by necessity, given his work on trade for the last 6 months, is of the opinion that out of concern for a more effective approach out of Washington, D.C., China is already calibrating its approach to Australia. So, after the last 6 months where China has been ratcheting up nonstop, if you look at post-inauguration, China's been pretty careful. And again, part of that is something I mentioned earlier. to have a clarion statement come out from Jake Sullivan, the then appointed national security advisor, to say, this shall not stand, we've got Australia's back, means that that's ultimately something that's in Australia's interest. We're not alone in this. And you've seen moves today in the UK. I think you're going to see that across the board. A more coordinated approach is better for Australia, and a more coordinated approach, counterintuitively, is also better for China.
Interesting, Gordon. Something we'll be coming back to, no doubt. I think it's the single biggest issue.
No question.
In the foreign policy constellation. Gordon, you'll remember, we've got a question from someone who's just identifying as a community representative of the representative of the Uyghur community. How does the declaration of Uyghur genocide affect US-China relations? What are the implications for Australia?
So this is one of the reasons I gave the answer I gave to the previous question. The notion that there's going to be a grand bargain when there are very real and unignorable issues surrounding Taiwan, surrounding Hong Kong, and surrounding the Uyghurs. So the fact that the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, has stated repeatedly now since his swearing in that his own view that the Chinese treatment of the Uyghur population in Western China is tantamount to genocide. That fundamentally frames the parameters of the policy and the discussion. And it's one that, to be honest, Australia has been a little bit more careful about, understandably, but that's going to be a big issue. And it's not going to be limited just to Chinese borders. A lot of the questions that came into us were about what's going on in Burma, and I won't claim to be an expert in Burma, but even what happens in Burma has to be viewed in the context of that broader question of China and China's role, because 10 years ago, when Aung San Suu Kyi was elected and let out of house arrest, that was widely seen as Burma or Myanmar distancing itself from China. There's no question that the reassertion of military control through a coup d'etat by the military is done with the blessing of China and is seen as a recalibration of Burma moving back more closely to China. And in fact, the fact that China came out shortly after the coup and announced it as a significant cabinet reshuffle tells you everything you think you need to know.
Sure. Just on Blinken, I'd commend to everybody an interview he gave with NBC News, and we linked to it, I believe, the US Study Center linked to it in our latest edition of our newsletter, the 46th, previously known as the 45th, but we're up to Biden as the 46th president of the United States. But anyway, in that interview, what was really interesting about it, Gordon, was this explicit linking of what the United States needs to be doing internationally with what it needs to be doing domestically, and linking of Build Back Better, the name, the slogan for this program for revitalization of the American economy and investments in strategic sectors, as a way of addressing sort of weaknesses in America's ability to project power abroad. I thought it was really interesting by a new Secretary of State to be that clear, and I think it's a big element of Biden administration thinking about the way to project power means to build it at home, number one, but not just in things like, say, technologies, strategically important technologies and whatnot, but democracy and the robustness of American, not just political institutions, but institutions more broadly, and civil society as well. Really a far-sighted and very comprehensive statement. Also, real nuance on China.
Yeah.
Yes, we compete and have an adversarial relationship, there's the US, with China. Then there are things in the middle, and then there are things on which we're looking to cooperate with China. So yeah, I agree with you, a sort of a grand bargain where I think climate change and trade and perhaps even some security issues are all sort of linked together in some. I think that's a bridge too far. And I don't know that, you know,
Well,
I think that's
can I
death
make,
by a thousand cuts and opening yourself up to
can I make
being
this a little bit
wedged.
more,
Yeah.
a little bit more explicit? The grand bargain verbiage implies kind of a G2 world where China and the US to get together and make their deal and they solve the world. And that's clearly not the way Anthony Blinken thinks about the world.
No, that's right.
And judged by the same themes coming out in the president's speech today, that's not the way he views the world.
No.
They understand, rightly, I believe, that the real source of American power isn't just the strength of the US military or the strength of the US economy, although they do recognize that American democratic institutions and America's economy have to be strong for the America to project power. But the real strength of the US is the systems it built after the Second World War.
Yeah.
The international, as we in Australia refer to it, rules-based order, the alliances the United States has around the world. And unfortunately, while every country in the world, of course, prioritizes its own national interests, a US policy which articulated America first almost always meant America alone because it was highly transactional. It didn't leverage alliances. It didn't leverage values. It didn't leverage institutions, standards, and norms, which were all in the advantage, not just of the United States, but of the system. And so the Biden speech today the part of that I found most informative was that underlying conclusion that we do this not just because it's good for the international system, but because it is good for what he described as our naked self-interest. But to be able to articulate the naked self-interest of Australia and the United States, both residing in that international system of standards, norms, institutions, agreements, laws, the rules-based order, is a welcome departure from the last 4 years. And I think that's why it's been so well received in Canberra and elsewhere.
Yep. Well said, Gordon. Nice summary. And truth be told, Biden's speech today at the State Department is probably what you should be referring to before going back to Blinken's interview from 3 or 4 days ago. Incredibly significant that an incoming president goes to the State Department for a speech. His first speech for it.
I know we're out of time, but one of the games in Washington, D.C. that I spent 25 years there, and my colleagues from Japan or Korea or Southeast Asia or even Australia were always really keen to figure out in the State of the Union, were they mentioned, right? That was just the game. And I've spent a good chunk of my career working on North Korea, and it was quite remarkable that North Korea did not get a mention in the great big foreign policy speech. So you might imagine in my circles, that's all the Twitter today. So
yeah, right. So many questions here. Thank you, everybody who's sending questions. I've tried to sort of touch on the themes at least. Gordon, we're down to 60 seconds, and there's a bunch of questions here, and it's something that's increasingly on our radar at the US Study Centre, and question we've been asked ever since before Biden was elected, and that is climate change potentially a wedge issue between the two governments, the Australian and the US government? As that Australia perhaps finds itself, I don't necessarily agree with this characterization, a climate laggard. That's the critique that's out there. Just your thoughts on that argument and that sort of set of concerns.
There is no question that Australia is going to have to recalibrate its position and its phrasing, at least, how it characterizes its approach on climate change to match a new world. And it's not just the United States. Remember, Australia was given a lot of cover because the United States was so much out of kilter with the world order, right? But now that the Biden administration, almost day one, actually on day one, returned to the Paris Climate Accords, right? The fact that they made it clear from the intelligence community, from the defense community, from the energy community, every one of those, that climate change is a major priority, means that will permeate the relationship. But again, I have no doubt that Australia is capable of doing that, and that will become an area of collaboration and communication. We're going to have to deal with our own domestic politics here as well. I get that, but in the big picture, you mentioned it spot on. The priority for the Biden administration is going to be COVID. And then once you get beyond that, they're going to be focusing on economic recovery. Then they've got these big picture foreign policy issues to deal with. But the notion that the Biden administration is sitting down together and saying, all right, those Aussies are a real problem on climate change.
Yeah.
That's our number one priority, is to get Australia back in line, kind of misses the context we're in right now. Yes, we have to calibrate, but I'm actually much more optimistic about the environment we face going forward.
Yeah, and my own assessment is similar to that. The only other thing I'd add in the closing seconds here is that I'm actually I'm quite pessimistic about climate change, much change on climate change, because of the very delicate balance of power in the US Congress at the moment. I think to the extent Biden can move there, it'll be through executive orders and things he can do off his own desk, and perhaps signing up for international agreements. But there isn't going to be much political appetite in this Congress, where the Democrats only have a 6-seat majority in the House of Representatives for anything particularly bold, if anything at all, frankly. And I think over time that might take some of the sort of Sturm und Drang on that issue away, as I think the world sort of wakes up to the reality that the US is sort of doing some things, but perhaps not as much as they were talking about during the campaign, just because of where Congress is, the composition of Congress. And
whether it's solar or hydrogen, we've got an awful lot to solve for that narrative too. It's just a matter of us pivoting towards that. Hey, before you give the final words, I'm just saying we're really looking forward to hosting next month, so I get to turn the tables and ask you the questions. I'll work together with Simon to have a guest join us as well. Thank you, Simon, for
thank you, and that's good enough for final words, Gordon. And we're out of time. Thanks to everybody that joined us. Again, it's a crowded agenda in Washington at the moment. We could have easily done an hour politics and an hour policy, but we'll come back in a month from now, as Gordon said, with a guest from Washington, as who's in the administration and perhaps who isn't gets a little clearer, and lining up guests gets perhaps a little easier as the deck chairs are rearranged. The musical chairs ends at least round one or so. But that'll be a month from now, so keep an eye on your emails for invitation for that. But roughly 4 Fridays from now, same time, same bat channel and all that. Thanks, Gordon.
Thank you, Simon. Appreciate it. Okay. Thank you all for joining.
And thanks to the team in Sydney, Janine and the team, and thanks to Lisa and everybody out at Perth. Have a great weekend.
Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to catch all of the latest from the United States Study Centre.